this is important to get a hold of historically is because how Jews begin to understand themselves historically during this next 1,000, 2,000 years is not as much bound to the language of Israel and the language of Jerusalem as much as the language of being Jewish. So having the rights to be Jewish and to be able to function in society as a Jew is much more important to them than necessarily establishing a nation state. This is a kind of interesting development within the Jewish community. And so the importance of religion as a marker of understanding self, right, as opposed to the definition of nationhood or kingdom, right? These are kind of separated from the two. So as we move forward, we're going to watch, and suddenly this all disappears, right? So here we have the Roman Empire almost at its height, right? And you can get a sense of just this amazing extent of this empire. And you see Judea and you see Jerusalem there, but they're very small, very almost inconsequential parts of the empire. They're important for their road systems, they're important for the port of Caesarea, but aside from that, Rome doesn't spend much time thinking about them. They're not that concerned about them. And what's important to understand from the perspective of the Jews is that they can participate in the entire empire. Even though Judaism was banned from Judea, the diaspora is allowed to continue to function. So Jews in these other areas are allowed to continue to be Jewish communities, to worship in their own way, and are not particularly subject to any kind of discrimination. Hadrian puts a lot of laws in place to limit them, but upon his death, many of those laws are kind of done away with. So Jews are now spread out throughout the Roman Empire with major concentrations in places like Babylon and Alexandria. The empire, of course, shifts as the Germans, I don't want to call the Germans barbarians, but whatever you want to call the Germans. But this wonderful, the emergence of Visigoths and all the Franks, and they take over what we think of as Western Europe, or large portions of Western Europe. But the Byzantine Empire holds on. Of course, the Byzantines are going to convert to Christianity, and want to make Christianity the kind of center of their political life, so they become a Christian empire, which is interesting because then, of course, we have this really powerful connection between Christianity and the empire, right? So Justinian is both a defender of the empire, but he's also a defender of the faith. And this becomes a very important thing for Christians. Jews in that community are going to find themselves at odds. The church is not as excited about Judaism in that context, and so they're going to find themselves oftentimes persecuted. But if you note, a lot of the areas that they had centered their power, specifically in Babylon, are no longer under control of the Byzantines. The Persians are there. Persians have no real prejudice against the Jews, and so those communities in Babylon continue to expand and grow all throughout this period. But again, the concept of Israel, the concept of Palestine, has disappeared. This is a map about 100 years after Justinian, well, 150 or so years after Justinian, of the first wave of Islam and its expansion. You can see the first areas are where the Prophet and the first four caliphates expanded to, the original kind of emergence of the caliphate. The second is the expansion under the Abbasids, the Umayyads, and then they get to their extent in 1750. The Umayyad Empire was quite extensive. Of course, major portions of Spain, all the way through Persia. So Persia disappears. Again, the Jewish populations are now going to fall under, not under Christian rule, but they're going to fall under Muslim rule. And these communities are accepted as part of the understanding that they are part of the book. They're part of the larger sequence of knowledge about God. They all worship the singular one God. They all are descended from the prophet Abraham. And so there's this wide connection. These communities get to succeed, to continue. The Christian communities and the Jewish communities get to maintain themselves in places like, now Babylon by this point is gone, but Baghdad, Damascus, you see Cairo, large Jewish community. Large Jewish community in Medina. So when the prophet goes to Medina in the flight from Mecca, he's going to be interacting with Jewish tribes in Medina, and they're going to be working together. So Jews are going to face some limitations. They have to pay taxes, special taxes if they don't convert and so forth, similar to the Christians. But these communities, again, it's all defined about religion, right? The definition of religion, not so much about creating nationality. We don't see Jewish communities trying to establish a nation state somewhere in the midst of these empires. The imperial process, in many ways, deletes the concept of nationality. Doesn't destroy the concept of ethnicity, that's not, right? Nor does it destroy the concept of religion. But the concept of nationhood disappears and kind of fades. So we find Jews in Cordoba. We find Jews all across North Africa, everywhere that there is Islamic states or the empire. We see the emergence of Jewish communities or the re-emergence of Jewish communities. This map just gives you a sense of the expansion under the Abbasids. The Abbasids overthrow the Umayyads, basically arguing that the Umayyads were not as strict as following the Quran correctly, so they're kind of more conservative. You want to talk about that group. They expand. They go on an expansionist agenda. They move, of course, across through Persia, all the way into Turkmenistan, into those areas in Central Asia, down, of course, down along the west coast of Africa. So we see a major expansion of Islam itself. And again, the Jewish communities that are there or that are in these areas are going to be absorbed into the process of being run by the Abbasids. They have very clear definitions that Jews are to be allowed to maintain their religion. And so Jewish communities continue to operate as citizens of these dynasties. And one of the things, just a little side note, but it's always fascinating, historians talk about these communities. We know that there were networks, both of Muslim and Jewish communities, that extended as far as wide as Fez in Morocco, all the way to Persia. That these families would have had large matrimonial and patrimonial constructs all across the area. And so they would have been interacting with each other as communities of Jews or as Muslims, and not so much concerned about, I'm a Moroccan, or I'm a Tunisian, or I'm an Iranian, right? So linguistically, lots of challenges, right? Lots of people have to, Arabic's the main language, but there's lots of secondary languages. All these things are being shaped while religion is the center point, right? What defines you as a human in this community is your religious identity. Of course, ultimately, the Abbasids are going to fall to the Ottoman Turks. There's a little thing called the Crusades in there. I'm not going to get into details of that. The Crusades really do create a lot of challenges for us, specifically about the question of Palestine, because, of course, what exactly is Palestine in the Crusaders' mind? It is not a Jewish society. It is not an Arab society. Rather, it is a Christian society, and for the most part made up of Europeans who are conquering Arabs and attempting to establish new kingdoms. And if you look, I was debating this question because the Crusades can be really complicated and fun stuff. And I decided we're going to skip that because I only have like whatever 40 minutes. And I mean, even this lecture in itself is kind of crazy to do because I teach this for 15 weeks, so I'm not sure if the kids get it then. But I just want to give you a real quick snapshot. So this is the Ottomans, right? The Ottomans start in central Turkey and then begin this expansion, basically reconquering territories that had been either fallen to the Mongols or fallen to other groups, and establish themselves once again in this context of the Caliph, right? The Caliphate. So the Ottomans take over the Caliphate as well as, right, the imperial rule. So they're going to be emperors, right, sultans, which is a kind of a political role, and then they're also going to be defenders of the faith, the caliphs. And that's very important to understand in the context of this larger discussion of where we are today in the 21st century in the language. And again, you can see Jerusalem falls into that area, into the area of acquisition. And again, nation states, all these various nations that we think about today, none of these things exist. None of these concepts exist until the 20th century. It's really quite striking how easily, if you were a member of the Ottoman Empire, if you were living in the Ottoman Empire, how you could move through the Ottoman Empire you could trade, you could engage. Your role in the society defined by your religion, in the sense of what you could do legally, but your role in terms of your political or your economic activity defined completely by your abilities. If you had money, you could move you could move goods and services, or do all kinds of things anywhere. You could operate in Egypt. You could operate in Turkey. You could operate in what we would think of as Iraq today. And so these communities operated all across the area. And again, definition of self in the context of religion, right? Your religious community. Nation states don't exist. Here you can get a sense, you can see Persia emerges, right? So the Persians kind of re-emerge at the end of the 19th century. But the Ottoman Empire, which is slowly but surely decayed through the 19th century, right? You guys have heard that, the old sick man of Europe construct, that the Ottomans were kind of slowly but surely being eaten away at. This is what the empire looks like in 1914. Egypt is technically part of the empire, but is ruled by England. And basically what we think about as the Middle East today, or at least the Arabian Peninsula, is controlled by the Ottomans, and then what we think of modern-day Turkey. So this is what the map looks like right before the war starts. And now we'll come to the question of Palestine. So let's take a look. You know, one of the things it's hard to remember, maybe 20 minutes ago, but there was these maps of Kingdom Israel, and Lake Tiberias was definitely part of Israel, seen to be part of Palestine, and so forth. But here you can see the way that the Ottomans have divided things up. The Jerusalem is its own Mustafari, so it's its own sort of self-governing city, governed by the Vilayet of Syria. So Damascus, which is the center of the Vilayet of Syria, is the kind of the governor's home, runs or rules over Jerusalem. On the flip side, this area to the east bank, east bank of the Jordan is run by the Vilayet of Beirut. So it's a kind of strange construct. It has a lot to do with Ottoman politics and a lot less to do with geography and who gets what. You might say to yourself, what's so great about having the east bank of the Jordan? Well, you can kind of see it there. There's a rail line running through the middle. This is the Damascus to Mecca route. This is the way to do the pilgrimage. Right? So the Hajj. So it's big money. That's what it's about. Jerusalem, nobody's really going to Jerusalem. Jerusalem's kind of a small town. There's about, let me just get the number here for you. There are, let's see, I want to be slightly accurate occasionally. Here we go. There's roughly 500,000 people living in the area around the Mustafari of Jerusalem and Gaza and Jaffa. So if you look at Jaffa there, just above Mustafa, Gaza, Hebron. The big city would be Jerusalem. Jericho actually would probably even be larger at that time. If you've been to Jerusalem, of course, if you've seen the old city is quite small. It was rebuilt by Saladin, and so that's the city you're in there is a period during the Crusades when it was reconstructed. Then you see this massive city to the west of Jerusalem, and that's the modern city of Jerusalem. None of that's there in 1914, just the old city itself. So if you think about this, the way that if you were living in Jerusalem, your relationship would be Damascus. You would be someone who could easily travel across the river, easy to travel across the rivers, going into places like Salt and Amman. You can see Asalt there, and Jerash. All these cities important. The communities were absolutely linked. There was clearly no distinctions between what was on the east bank and the west bank of the Jordan. These communities moved back and forth. Whether they were Arab Muslims or Jews, it didn't really matter. They were all crossing back and forth. These were communities and economies that were absolutely linked. And if you've been there, one of the things you'll note is Jerusalem's on the top of basically a ridgeline of mountains that descend towards the Jordan, right? So the communities move together, right? Just by nature of their kind of the flow of the rainwater, if you will. Also important to note, just a quick side note, but the economy, these are very strong agrarian economies. So they're able to maintain themselves. They're important to the community. They're not huge economies. They're not massive economies that are going to change the nature of the Ottoman Empire. But they're important, and these are self-sustaining communities that have long histories that are there. So I guess we could always blame the Europeans for all this mess, because of course in 1916, in the midst of the war, the British and the French decide that they're going to reorganize the Middle East. And I like this map for a variety of reasons. One is this is what the Sykes-Picot Agreement looked like when it was represented on a map. And again, if you take a look at it, it's quite confusing, right? What's going on here? There's blue zones where the French want to have direct control, which is this urban areas in Anatolia. There's this deep red zone to the east there in Iraq, where the British want to maintain control. Why do they want to control these areas? Well, it's about oil, right? These are where the oil wells are. The light blue zone, the A zone, which is where the French want to exert control around Mosul. You guys probably have heard of Mosul recently in the news, right? But Mosul, of course, has oil fields. So again, oil is important from their perspective. The light pink area there, which is the British influence, what's that about? Well, that's about connecting Egypt with Iraq. That's about a train, that's about a rail system and a road system that connects them together. And you can still see those roads together. Those roads are still there today. It's the very same roads you drive. If you drive across Jordan, you're driving on the same roads that were built. Some of them were built by the Romans way back in the day, but they're the same roads. So it's about roads. And then you see this really strange little thing here, right? The Allied condominium. They don't mean housing. They mean something about them jointly ruling this area with some construct of purpose they're not quite sure about. So the question is, what is this thing going to be? It's important to note that this is a French diplomat and a British diplomat deciding this over a table, not particularly asking any of the community, right? Not involved at all in the decision making. But if you look at that map, there's no boundaries that we could recognize today. Maybe you could recognize a little bit of what we think of as Israel, maybe. Right? But even those boundaries are pretty undefined. Right? You can see the Gaza Strip's much larger, much longer. It goes farther up into what we think of as Lebanon. But this is not a particularly defined map. What emerges, of course, is that in 1916 we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but at the same time we have the British organizing what is known as the Arab Revolt. So this is your T.E. Lawrence, right, Lawrence of Arabia stuff, which is wonderful to watch. I recommend the movie, it's awesome. And it's actually fairly accurate in its construct. But what's important about that is that the Arabs that they're talking about are the Hashemites. And the Hashemites have been an Arab community that have been controlling Mecca and Medina for a long time. They've been in charge of Mecca and Medina as part of the Ottoman Empire. They basically run Mecca and Medina for the Ottomans, right? And everything's great. It's great to be a Hashemite at the time because you get all the revenues of the Hajj, and you don't have to pay too much to the Ottomans. But the British basically offer the Hashemites a new construct. They say, well, look, we will let you grow. You can be in charge of the Arabs, right? So we'll make you in charge of the Arabs. I'm not sure what that means. Right? I mean, this is, from Faisal's construct, or this is King Faisal, the Hashemite king, is just, well, that's wonderful, yeah. But what is the Arabs? Right? Well, the Arabs are all these people all throughout these areas that they've divided up. And so this is going to be a real challenge here, because what he knows to be the Arabs and what the British and the French are willing to actually hand over are two very different things. Organizes the revolt succeeds in driving the Ottomans out of Palestine. It's important to understand that the Arabs, without Arab support, the British would not have been able to capture Palestine. The Ottomans are being undermined by this revolt on the east side of the Jordan. So the Arabs are absolutely important in undermining the Ottomans' ability to supply their troops in Palestine, and as a result, the British are able to drive them out. Famously, of course, the Arabs won up the British and captured Damascus, right? And unlike in the movie where it's a disastrous situation, that's not what actually happens. The Arabs do just fine when they take Damascus and are actually kicked out of Damascus later by the French. So it's an interesting twist on the history there in the movie. But the movie has its own purposes, right? So, but what I want you guys to think about here is that when we come to the end of this war, World War I, it absolutely changes everything, right? I mean, we're in the moment right now of historically remembering the 100 years of the anniversary of the war. And this war has, I would say, undermined or retooled or created revolutions in every aspect of our society, whether it's Asia, the Middle East, whether it's Russia. Of course, they're going to have the revolution in 1917. This is going to fundamentally turn over the world. In the context of us as Americans, right, it's a huge moment for us as the United States. We enter the war, we come out as a world power. Right? So this is a war that changes everything. And it does that in the Middle East. Specific to the question of Palestine and Israel, how it changes the Middle East is that at the very same time that the British are divvying all this stuff up between themselves and the French, the British decide to support the construction of a Jewish homeland in the territory designated as part of the Allied condominium. In 1917, the British issue what is known as the Balfour Declaration. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's kind of fascinating. I want you to, this is like, if you've got any English teachers out there, listen. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine, so the language is there, right? Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Yeah, right? Okay, good. So we're changing everything, but we're not changing anything, right? We don't want you to mess with the Jews in Baghdad because they're Jews and they live in Baghdad, right? But we are going to create the conditions for Jews to move to Palestine, as long as that doesn't upset the balance of power in Palestine. Tough to do, right? What ends up happening, of course, is the British are going to find themselves in a pickle. So, the French find themselves in a real bind in Syria. Faisal and his forces are in Syria. They've got Damascus, but Sykes-Picot says that that's Syrian. So what the French do is they go to war with Faisal, and they kick Faisal out. So Faisal gets thrown out. They capture Syria. But then the French say, we're so busy messing about in Syria and in Lebanon that we're going to let the British have control of this thing called Palestine. But we're going to use Mr. Wilson's idea, right, of this League of Nations in which colonies are created, right, and handed over to the League of Nations to be administered until they are given their independence. What colonies are we talking about? We're talking about German colonies. Right? German colonies taken from the Reich, right? So places like Cameroon, handed over to the British and the French, right? But Palestine is sitting there and they don't know what to do with it, so they create a mandate, the British Mandate in Palestine. Interestingly enough, just a quick side note, when the United States investigated this question in 1919, we sent a commission, the King Crane Commission, to visit the area. And all of the Arab communities in the area, so this is in Iraq, Syria, and in Palestine, all of them say they would prefer if the United States would be the mandate power because they would be guaranteed their independence in the future. They didn't trust the British and the French, for good reason. But the French are out, so the British get the mandate. So the British establish the mandate there in purple. The problem with the mandate, of course, is what? That you're supposed to set the course for independence. That's the purpose of mandates, is that ultimately they're supposed to become independent states. They're not supposed to become part of your empire. The British decide that Faisal, who was an ally throughout this war, right, who they liked very much, they didn't want to upset too much, that they needed to give him something. Right? So they gave him Iraq. They gave him the kingdom. They created this kingdom in Iraq. And then they gave his brother, Abdullah, this place called the Transjordan. So they created out of whole cloth this state on the east bank of the Jordan. Again, you can see that rail line, right? So he's going to have, the Hashemites will be in charge of the Hajj, and that's perfect. They're going to have their money, everything's fine. There's going to be some Saudis that cause a problem with that, and of course the Saudis are going to kick the Hashemites out, and the Hashemites are going to be left in Jordan and Iraq. And the Saudis are going to capture Mecca and Medina. Another history. That's a different class. But it's important, right? Okay, so there we go. You guys see something there, right? I see Israel. We can start recognizing, right? We can start conceiving. But it's not Israel, it's Palestine. You see, now I've got problems. I got linguistic problems here. I got Israel and I've got Palestine and I've got images together in my head. And the purpose of this creation is to do what? Bring Jews to this homeland, to encourage people to come and settle in this area, right? But at the same time not upset the political balance and the economic balance and civil rights of Arabs living in the community. Arabs who are not defined, right, as Palestinians, but as Christians and Muslims. Right? Indeed, most of the population is Arab. Even the Jewish populations are Arab. Right? They're all Arabic-speaking populations. These are the Sephardic Jews. But the Ashkenazi, the European Jews, are going to be the ones who are coming. Right? This is who Theodor Herzl and the Zionists are bringing to the area. Well, you can imagine as this population changes. Again, I said it was about 500,000 in 1890. By the time we get to, just to give you a sense, 1890, 500,000 people living in the area, 5% Jewish, 10% Christian, 85% Muslim. So that's 1890. By the time we get to the 1930s, that changes fairly dramatically. We've got roughly 25% of the population now is Jewish. Right? All recent immigrants. And they're coming and they're purchasing land, and they're purchasing land oftentimes from former Ottomans, people who were the leaders who have now been, of course, dispossessed of that land. And this creates a real tension between the people who are living on the land, right, the farmers who were renting this land, and oftentimes in decadal contracts, and the owners of that land who just want to make some money. So they're willing to sell that land and the title to that land to these Jewish settlers. The consequences of this is that there's tension between the Arab